had a worship experience there. I'm standing kind of backstage off to the side, and we're singing Living Hope, and I'm just kind of full out worshiping, and I'm like, this is kind of awkward, because like nobody can see me, and I'm like 3 feet from Lily. Right, like Lily's right here playing bass, and like I'm behind the screen just kind of full out, like singing in her ear, just kind of right there all by myself in my own little worship moment. But I love singing songs about the goodness of God and the hope that we have in God. I'm so glad to be with you again this morning as we wrap up our Life on Mission series. And this series really has been one that's all about how we live out the ultimate walk with Christ. A series all about how we take the historical doctrine of our faith and apply it in the midst of our everyday lives. And so a couple of weeks ago, my friend Sean from Young Life kicked us off on this concept about talking about how a life on mission is always facing forward. It's always chasing after, always striving after the example of Jesus. A life on mission faces forward and chases after Jesus because a life on mission understands that the best is yet to come. Right? That the best days aren't behind us. That what God is about to reveal, what God is about to do is going to pale in comparison to what we've experienced in the past. And so a life on mission is simply centered on Jesus. And that was week 1 of this series. Last week I talked about what has to be my least favorite concept or topic in the world, money. Right? But it was important because what we did is we looked at this concept of tithing that we see in the Old Testament, where the people of God are called to give a flat 10% of everything they have to God. Right? They're called to give a flat 10% of everything they have to God because Scripture says that's what God deserves. They're called to give it a flat 10% to make sure that they're putting God first in their lives and to make sure that God's work is fully supplied. That's the Old Testament command. But in the New Testament, we see a different command. Right? It's a concept that we call grace giving. And grace giving, we looked at, is supposed to be regular. It's meant to be personal. And then it's meant to be proportional. Right? What that means is that it's meant to be regular, or it's something we're supposed to do on a regular basis. It's meant to be personal. Every one of us needs to be doing it. It's not just a command for some people, and then it has to be proportional. Simply put, the more you're blessed, the more you should give. Right? You see, in the New Testament command of grace giving, it's not just a flat 10%. No, we're called to give freely. We're called to give joyfully. We're called to give proportionately to how we've been blessed. And for some of us, that's a little bit. And that's okay. But for others, it might be a lot more. You see, for some of us, grace giving proportionately might be 5 or 6%, and that's okay. But for others who are greatly blessed, it might even be as much as 25 or 30%. Why? Because God has given to us abundantly, so we need to give abundantly. And so a life on mission is one that understands that everything that we have comes from God. And we need to give back what God requires. We need to give back what God deserves because it belonged to Him in the first place. That was last week. And this week, as I started to think about how I wanted to wrap up this series, a word came to mind that we kicked around at our staff meetings a few weeks ago, and it was this: surrender. So what I want to suggest to you this morning, the first thing I wrote when I started to write for this week was this: the life on mission is one that is surrendered to God. That sounds good, right? A life on mission is one that is surrendered to God. A life that follows the direction of God. And I'll be honest, as I wrote those words, the first thing that came to my mind was really 2 things. That sounds good, right? We can go there. Our life on mission is one that's surrendered to God. But my second thought was this: a life on mission is one that's surrendered to God. That's a really hard concept. It's a concept that can feel foreign at times. can feel unattainable at times. And so while the concept and theology behind it of this, a life on mission, is surrender to God, we're good. Here's the thing. I thought the practicality of that was really hard to grasp. Have you ever had something in your life that you really just kind of dug in your heels about? Right? Like something in your life where you knew it had to be done your way or else the entire world was going to just collapse around you. Right? You know what I'm talking about? Like something that just has to be done your way. There's no other way to do it. There's no room for error outside of the way you think it has to be done. And it doesn't even have to be important stuff. So like I'll share an example. My wife and I love to go to Disney World. Right? We go to Disney World all the time. So all right, that's Halloween a few years ago. Yes, I actually shaved my head to do the Friar Tuck that Halloween. But we love to go to Disney World. We go all the time. We go 4 or 5 times a year. But here's the thing. Disney doesn't always bring out the best in me. Why? Because there's a certain way I want to do the parks. And it involves getting up really, really early and getting to the gates of the park like an hour before they open, to stand in a crowd of people and then rush towards the busiest attractions right at rope drop. Right? There's another picture here we'll throw up. You'll see it's dark outside. That's not because it's nighttime. That's because the sun has not come up yet. Right? Because here's the thing. I know in my heart of hearts that if we don't do it that way, then if we don't get up and get to the parks before they open and stand in this crowd of people and then rush and power walk as fast as we can towards the busiest attractions, then I won't get to ride them for like the 500th time. Right? Like I know that. And here's the thing, it's completely irrational because if you know me, you know I hate early mornings. Yes. I'm not a morning person at all, except for there. Why? Because I want to do it my way. And the more I thought about that, the more I began to think how we all have pockets of that in our lives. Right? We all have places in our lives where we say, no, I want to do that my way. And here's the thing. What I want to suggest to you this morning is this, that there is nothing more toxic, there is nothing more destructive, there is nothing that pulls you further away from a life on mission than the phrase, I want to do it my way. You see, sometimes when we demand our own way, we're simply just expressing our opinion. Sometimes we say, hey, I want to do it my way because we're screaming, hey, look at me, you see, I'm here, I exist. I have a vision for what can happen. I like it this way and not that way. Sometimes that's just the expression of our lives, but here's the thing, I think there's a deep trouble that comes when we want our way more than we want anything else. And so the question for us today becomes, if a life on mission is one that is surrendered to God, how do we eliminate the pockets of I want to do it my way in our life? How do we eliminate the pockets of I want to do it my way in our life? And the reality of that is I don't think it comes easy for any of us. This idea of a life surrendered to God that requires us to set aside the pockets of I want to do it my way in our lives, it doesn't come easy, it's hard. And so often it's something that we have to wrestle with God over. And then it hit me. I wrote those words this week and it really hit me, this idea that it's something that we have to wrestle with God over, that maybe there were some lessons we can learn about this struggle. This wrestling from somebody who literally wrestled with God in the Bible. And so this morning I actually want to take a look at Genesis 32. And there we read this. During the night Jacob got up and he took his 2 wives, his 2 servant wives, and his 11 sons and crossed the Jabbok River with them. That's a whole lot of people. Right? Just think about that. Like 2 wives, 2 servant wives, 11 sons. We're up to like 20 people right there. Right? That's a whole lot of people, but he takes them and he crosses the Jabbok River with them. And after taking them to the other side, he sends all of his possessions. So he's got all of his people there and all of his stuff. This left Jacob all alone in the camp. You see, previous to this, he's surrounded by people. He's surrounded by his possessions. He's surrounded by the way he has filled out his world. And then he takes all of them, he sends them to the other side of the river, and he's all alone. And he's there alone until the dawn began. He's there all alone. And a man comes and wrestles with Jacob until the dawn began to break. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. Then the man said, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." "What is your name?" the man asked. He replied, "Jacob." The man says, "Your name will no longer be Jacob. From now on you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won." "Please tell me your name," Jacob said. "Why do you want to know my name?" the man replied. And then he blessed Jacob there. Jacob called this place Peniel, which means face of God, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been spared." And when we read that, it kind of comes off as a little bit of a weird story, right? Like the plot isn't completely clear at the beginning. We kind of gather by the end that apparently the man that Jacob wrestles with is God, but we don't readily know that when we begin reading. But still, I think there's some stuff that we can pull out of this text. Because at the end of the day, what we see here is Jacob, a man who desperately wants to do things his way and has to wrestle with God over it. The first thing I think we can pull from this text is this. In our lives, we all seek a blessing. Right? We as adults have learned this language of how to hide our selfishness and self-absorption. Right? We come up with ways of asserting our desires cleverly, right? We kind of mask them so it doesn't look like we're throwing the same temper tantrums that our kids do. But the reality is that's what we do, right? We all want our blessings. We all want it our way. Jacob had done that as well. You see, for Jacob, this language that he hid behind was this language of seeking a blessing. He lived in a culture, in a religious context in which the importance of seeking a blessing was something that everybody understood. Not only that, when you look at Jacob's family context, it's even more paramount. Why? Because Jacob had grown up hearing about God's blessing. Right? He had grown up about hearing about God's blessing to Abraham and how it would be through his family that God's blessing would extend to the entire world. Jacob had heard about the miraculous birth of his father Isaac. You see, blessing to Jacob wasn't just any concept. Blessing was a concept that had major stakes in his lives. And so he had to get it. He had to get after it. He needed a blessing if his life was going to play out the way he thought it should. The trouble was this. Jacob felt like he had lost the blessing of his family to his brother Esau at their birth. And as a result, he came into the world frustrated and angry because he thought life wasn't going to turn out the way he thought it should. His name, Jacob, literally means heel ground. It means striver, coercer, someone who's going to struggle to get things the way he wants them. And we see when we follow Jacob's life through Scripture that he's aptly named. Eventually, Jacob goes and he cheats the blessing of his family away from Esau. And then he runs away. He hid from his family. He severs the relationships in his life that are most important. As far as we know, after he steals the blessing of his family, he never sees his mother or his father again. It's easy to read Scripture and vilify Jacob. But the reality of the situation is this. Jacob's motivation in life really isn't any different than most of ours. Right? Jacob's motivation in life really isn't different than most of ours. He just wants things the way he thinks they should go. And he's willing to do anything to make that happen. So the motivating factor in Jacob's life is blessing, yes, but when we follow the text of Jacob, what we read is even after he connives, even after he steals the blessing of his father from Esau, he realizes it's not enough. And I think we've all been there too, right? Where we chase after something in our lives so hard, we chase after something that we think is going to fulfill us, that we think is going to sustain us, and we chase after that with everything we got. And then when we get it, we find out it's just not enough. So when we look at Jacob, we see somebody who seems to be constantly struggling to gain more. Right? He's constantly struggling to gain more power. He's constantly struggling to gain more influence. He's constantly struggling to gain more livestock, more money. He's constantly trying to get after the bride that he wants. Why? Because Jacob has placed his entire identity in this concept of blessing. And I think that's something we do too. I think we wrap up our entire identities in our stuff. We define ourselves by our jobs, or by our families, or by our financial status, or by our hobbies. And if we're not careful about it, that can become all-consuming. We see that here in Jacob, a man who literally wrestled with God all night long. And when God finally says, "Let me go," look at Jacob's response. He says, the man says, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob says, "No, I won't let you go unless you bless me." You see, everything Jacob was chasing after is this idea of blessing. It's who he was. It had become his very identity. And so he wrestles with God all night long, and even in his wrestling with God, he can't let go. He said, "No, I won't unless you give me what I want. Unless you give me life my way, I won't do it." And I want you to look at how God responds. He says, "What is your name?" the man asked. He replied, "Jacob." Remember, Jacob means heel grabber, coercer. God says your name will no longer be Jacob. For now you'll be called Israel. Because you have fought with God, with men, and have won. You see, the moment before we read that God pours out his blessing upon Jacob, the moment before we read that God gives Jacob what he's chasing after all of his life, he does something radical. He changes his name. He gives him a new identity. And in doing so, he says this. He says, "Jacob, everything you placed as a priority in your life is about to change. You came into this night as one person, but you're leaving as somebody completely different. No longer Jacob, but Israel." And as I poured over that text this week, I think it finally hit me. A life on mission is surrendered to God, yes. But I think it's so much more complicated than that on a practicality level. Surrender is so much harder than that. So what I want to suggest to you, what I wrote is this. A life on mission wrestles with God and comes out changed. A life on mission wrestles with God and comes out changed. That's what surrender looks like. It means we wrestle with God. The things that we struggle with, they don't go away easily. No, it means we wrestle with God over them. We hold on to them tight. Why? Because we build ourselves up in them. And so we wrestle with God, but we comes out changed. And I think that's where we can start. And so as the band begins to come back up, I want to get ready to enter the next part of our worship this morning. You see, for most of us, I don't think there's going to be some magical moment on a Sunday morning where we come into this place and all at once we surrender our lives to God. But I'd like to see that happen. God is capable of doing that. I want to be clear there. But I just don't think that's the way it happens for most of us. That's just not how our spiritual journey unfolds. And here's the thing, that's okay. But if we're truly going to live a life that's on mission, what we need to do is begin to wrestle with God over the things that are not okay in our lives. Right? We need to begin to just wrestle with God over the things that aren't okay in our lives, and then on the other side of that, come out changed. To begin to struggle. To say, "God, here are the things in my life that are a mess. Here are the things in my life that are keeping me from chasing after you fully. So work with me on that. Wrestle with me on that. Change me in those things." We have to constantly be chasing after Jesus. Placing him first in all things. And when we find something we don't think we can give up, we need to wrestle with God about it until our hearts come out changed. You see, friends, a lifelong mission isn't a product. A lifelong mission is a process. Right? It's a posture that we have to choose each and every day.